You gave me goosebumps as you were talking about it, because I talk to a lot of people and many of them are inspired by a career that your career that you've had, moving in different roles and, as you mentioned, having such significant experience as well. What advice would you give to people maybe who are working in safety or elsewhere? What can they do to have such prideful moments in their career?
It goes back again to that credibility. So your goal within an organization, with the senior leadership, with the culture, it's not to win some kind of feedback war. Again, it's like you're there to protect the organization, and you also want to protect your credibility. Like, you don't want to lose that. So, I would say, again, be careful about correcting and focus more on staying credible, protecting performance, maintaining your integrity, preserving your influence. So,
what kind of indicators, KPIs you can use to connect? So can you give me some examples about this? Because sometimes, I think we have a traditional question about how to move to compliance to culture. But, how we need to connect safety, not just to talking about no compliance or accidents rates. So in your experience.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Headline Podcast with me, Dr. Megan Tranter, and also my amazing co-host, Andreza Araújo. And we've got another amazing conversation for you this week on our podcast with Heather MacDougall, JD. So we're talking to a lawyer this week, which is fantastic and different from all of the many people that we've had talking to us so far. Heather is the founder of MacDougall Solutions, and she's also the former chair of the US Commission for Safety and Health Review, although I've probably butchered that, Heather, so you can tell us in a minute the proper words. And Heather also served as the Vice President of Workplace Health and Safety at one of the biggest known brands in the world, at Amazon. So we're delighted to welcome Heather today. We want to talk about things like influence and culture and what's it like working in a regulatory agency and then maybe going to private industry. But we'll see where it goes, and we're really delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you, Megan and Andreza. It's a privilege to be here. So happy to be on your podcast.
Thank you. So one of the things I'm really curious about, and I think our audience is as well, because I hear this a lot from my coaching clients, is how do you influence senior leaders in various type of capacities and various type of roles?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into my specific thoughts on that topic, and I'm sure everyone has their own take on it. I would say a couple of things. I think it's really important to have that trust. That's probably the number one thing. But if you're really talking specifically about, when you go into a conversation and you're trying to influence that senior leader, what are they doing, those successful influencers compared to everyone else? What are the others missing? I would say that many times people are trying to go into these conversations looking to win an argument, so to speak, or win a debate. Whereas the influencers are not trying to be right. They're trying to make the organization stronger. So they understand that what that senior leader wants to achieve and what that senior leader needs to make a good decision. So for the senior leader, they get a lot of information. So they're trying to flush out information, insights, look at alternatives, what are the risks, what are the trade-offs? So they're unearthing those critical questions. So the really good senior leaders, they are very good at asking the right questions that the team has to answer. And they also know that when they go into a meeting, if it's 60 minutes, there's only so much time to ask questions. You can't ask that many. So you as an influencer, you have to go into those meetings with that information and really equip that senior leader to make a good decision. So, what does that look like? And I said first, the very first thing I would say is to earn trust. You have to build that relationship. You have to have integrity. You have to get to know the leader, get to know the business, and you have that honesty and transparency that really builds that trust. And then you have to look at how do you improve that decision architecture. So again, the clear vision for the future of your organization, and you can articulate how safety ties into that. What are the long-term goals? How does the safety team's efforts align with the organization's efforts, and how do you help them reach them? So I think along with that, I would talk about reducing uncertainty. Again, we have so much information. So how do we use that information? How do we weigh the pros and the cons so that we can take action like really confidently? So along with that, you have to have those good communication skills. You have to be persuasive. You have to listen to your team members. You have to reach out to SMEs. All of those people that you need to incorporate their feedback. So it's not just you going to the senior leader with this information. So, I guess that's where I would start, and I'd love to, hear what your take on it as well.
Heather, how your recommendation, to prepare the safety team is to occupy this kind of space, to be advisor, to giving for the board members specific information and attract the attention, and work together, building trust. So what is the preparation that you can recommend?
Yeah, I talk a lot about the relationships that you need with your strategic partners. So first, it's to identify who those are within your organization. Oftentimes it's going to be operational leaders, it's going to be finance, HR, legal. And I think nowadays that list of strategic partners is growing. It could be people in IT, it could be robotics, procurement. So just identify who all those strategic partners are that are really critical to being accountable and owners of safety, and also partners in working on this, designing the strategy, but also all of the parts that go into delivering on the strategy. So that's where I would start, is think about this as a business strategist. And we're business strategists who specialize in risk. We don't want to be seen as compliance officers, who are seeking permission. You really want to build that ownership, accountability across your entire organization.
Nice.
It's a huge list. Even when you were going through procurement, robotics, legal, like all these others, what advice would you give people who are perhaps new into a more senior role? Is there someone that they should talk to first, or how do they even put a plan together to figure out which person or which group they should talk to first?
Yeah, hopefully you have an onboarding plan that incorporates that into it. But if you have to build it yourself, I would say start by having one-on-ones. I love the
I love
one-on-ones,
it.
especially as you're new in an organization or a new role. Even get as many one-on-ones with those people who could be strategic partners, and they are certainly going to point you in the right direction. They're going to say like, hey, you really need to talk to Joe in procurement. So you're going to begin to build those relationships that are so important to that trust. And also they're going to be those partners that you need to have that credibility with, and ultimately they need to be the owners of. So I add a little bit of a caveat on that in terms of, don't go into those one-on-ones being critical. I think that's a mistake very early on, certainly within the first 90 days, maybe even longer. But I go into those meetings just really with curiosity, asking questions, listening, and building that trust. And that comes from, again, that credibility, because you're trying to understand their business and how what safety may be asking, how does that fit with the things that they're measured by? Because if you don't connect safety to overall performance, I think you're going to lose in the strategy.
In this direction, what kind of indicators, KPIs you can use to connect? So can you give me some examples about this? Because sometimes, I think we have a traditional question about how to move to compliance to culture. But, how we need to connect safety, not just to talking about no compliance or accidents rates. So in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody starts with the traditional lagging metrics, even though
Mm-hmm.
as a safety profession, we're trying to move away because we're recognizing that those aren't the best indicators of safety performance. So if you're talking about trying to understand the culture, you're trying to understand how leading metrics may be more impactful. I think, again, you start to have those conversations to understand what the culture is to begin with. Like, you first have to assess it to understand where there may be gaps. But I would say don't treat safety as that silo. That's like, again, that danger that we
Yeah.
can fall into is that, safety is viewed as over here, its own team, and they are oftentimes the police or the owners of it. So how do you equip managers, frontline managers, all the way up to senior leaders? How do you equip them to ask the right questions, to understand the complexity? I guess that's one thing I've just kind
Yeah.
of landed on in my own head here is like a lot of times leaders don't understand how complex safety is. Like they just think like, oh, let's tell me what to do to reduce TRIR. Like it must be simple. And it's not. We as safety professionals know that it's not. It's very complex. So how do we begin to have those conversations to understand all of the different levers that go into safety and risk and how you begin to move the needle on culture. And it really begins with looking at ways to impact climate, because we know climate is something that can change every day. It can go from good to bad if you have an incident. So what do you do to make it go to grow, to be better? And again, there's little things you can do in terms of equipping leaders with training, helping them to ask the right questions on the front line, um, and doing some kind of leading metrics around that. So I think there's a lot of great work that's been happening in the last few years in terms of what is really impactful in terms of leading metrics. So what are some that are going to work in your organization? And then how do you measure their effectiveness? How do you bring managers along on that journey so that they see it as not another just check the box, but like something that's really going to make an impact in terms of safety and the resilience of your culture?
I think sometimes we have a confusion, and I would like to explore this point with you in terms of roles and responsibilities from the CEOs and C levels, because the people say we need safety leadership. But how is your view for these C levels in terms of roles and responsibility to impact your organization to moving in a strong culture?
Yeah, I would say I love a racy. So that's kind of like a just high level place to start if you don't know what the different roles of people are within your organization. And oftentimes people are going to have different X's, in the columns of RACI. But that's a great place to start to see sort of what other people view as their role with safety, and then have that conversation with all of those strategic partners of who is responsible, accountable. Start to begin to understand that everybody has some role, and it's going to vary, depending on what the issue is. Like if we're talking about prevention through design, that's going to look differently than some other issues. So, with all of the different components that go into your management system, try and understand like how all of your strategic partners fit into that and try and get alignment on that. Again, building that credibility and that trust, because we know that safety has to be owned by everyone across the organization. But like your question is, what does that really mean? Like, what does that
Yeah.
translate into?
Yeah, because the translation, some people have the expectation, these guys be in the front with the front line, visiting the manufacturers, visiting the logistic centers. So how we can use it, the role to promote impact actions, not just this kind of routine that some supervisor need to do, and it has this kind of confusion. I'm sorry about that, but I think we need to talking more about, because I perceive this kind of confusion.
And I think a lot of times it's that hard conversation of what do we need to fix within our culture? And sometimes that's that, psychological safety is getting a lot of talk these days. But what does that look like in your organization? And where are there really roadblocks to having people speak up? Because we know, especially when it comes to serious incidents and fatalities, it's the shortcuts. It's the doing the same thing every day and not escalating it up to the point of the spear where decisions are being made. So they may view safety as being carried out or work being carried out in one way, but that's not the way it's really done at the front line. And you don't have visibility to that. So how do you make sure that you do have visibility to how the work is really being done and you're creating that psychological safety so that there are those learning conversations that are taking place?
3,800 meters below the North Atlantic, it is still there. Not as a ruin, but as evidence. 15,000 workers, 3 million rivets. The largest movable structure ever built by man and designed to be invincible. But the Titanic didn't sink by accident. It sank by decisions. Decisions made in boardrooms, on spreadsheets, in silences that no one had the courage to break. How was it possible? The answer isn't down there. It's up here, in the decisions we make every day. Soon we will dive into the history, the facts, and what the world's most famous accident taught us. Titanic, the silence we still hear. It's not about the tragedy. It's about what built this tragedy and what we learned from it.
Do you ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it. You know, I love this conversation we're having here, which is a conversation about conversations, whether it's with senior leaders or frontline workers or supervisors as well. Heather, what do you reckon is the easiest way to lose credibility with those different levels of people in organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I already hit on it. I mean, the easiest way to lose credibility is to lose trust or to not gain it in the first place. So again, going back to, you first got to earn it, that you don't just get it. It's not a given. So you have to earn that trust, and that takes time, and that takes listening and putting in the time to understand the business. And then the other way is to do something. You've done something that you've lost that trust, which is really hard to get back once you've lost it, whether it's work or anywhere. So in safety, I think, especially at that executive level, credibility isn't built on being right. And again, back to too often we all as people try to think about winning the argument or, being persuasive in that way. But I think, safety is, it's built on being relevant, enterprise aware. It's, understanding the operational realities. So, EHS comes in, gets that seat at the table with all those strategic partners, and you demonstrate that you understand their business. You understand that you're there to protect enterprise value. And you're trying not to create unnecessary friction. So, I think that's one of the things that helps reduce that friction and to build trust and then that credibility. Some of the things I would say to avoid it being eroded are, again, don't show up as the safety police. You have to tie it to operational performance, the customer, the reputation, something that signals that we're not just here operating in a silo, and that you understand the constraints that operations are in, that they've got schedule pressures, they've got margin pressures, they may have labor shortages, customer commitments and demands. So you can't ignore all of those realities, and you can have conversations about where safety sits and the trade-offs, but you can't ignore them. So acknowledge them and have those true conversations that, how do we reduce risk without compromising X, so have those conversations that really build that partnership. And I would also say, try to avoid the fear as your lever. A lot of times we go to that.
Yeah.
And I think, most executives understand that, safety is important, whatever you want to call it, safety first, and you're a top value. That commitment usually exists within an organization. So it's, again, how do we talk about the decisions that need to be made? How do we speak the language of the business, understand KPIs, and solve these issues, not with fear, but just being partners in them and trying to understand how safety is part of operational success.
I just have to ask something. There's so much wisdom that you're dropping here. I'm sure people want to know, how did you figure this out? Where did you get this wisdom from? Because you're just dropping it left and right. But how did you learn all of this stuff?
I think it's being curious and wanting to learn, and that's the really great thing about safety professionals is we have so many resources, like you two, and so many people who are willing to share their expertise and think about things in a new way, try to understand why things may have not worked in the past and what we can do differently. And there's just a lot of really great conversations that are going on. So I would encourage people just to lean into that. It's great to have people within your organization, I think, as well. So they're going to help you understand your business and their KPIs and, the things that they're dealing with besides safety every day so that you can have those conversations. So really important to do that within your organization. But there's so many great resources, whether it's podcast or, different safety organizations, ASSP, I'm on the board there. So I'll talk about them, but there's just so many great places for safety professionals to lean in with one another. And you have to then be really good, skilled at translating what you learn in those circles back to your organization. Because I oftentimes find that operations leaders, they do not want to hear the theories, the flavor of the day when it comes to safety. They don't want to hear about the Heinrich model. Make it real, make it translatable to what's going on in their organization. Not that there's something wrong with any of those, whether it's, Hoff or whatever the theory is, but you have to then take that from our conversations where we're like safety geeks and translate it back to your organization and the people that you're interacting with there.
Heather, I would like to explore the countercultures. Sometimes inside the organizations we're facing counter cultures. And I'd like to hear from you, what is your opinion, how the safety professionals facing this in the way to building, to build a strong culture, and how to, and also I would like to add in the same question, counter cultures and filters, because sometimes we want to create trust and, to build trust. But the information, the transparency, we have some barriers to put all the information on the table and to have a good discussion. What is your view about this and your recommendation?
I mean, I guess the first thing I thought of is like pick your battles, because I'm not sure that every one of those is worth it. But it goes back again to that credibility. So your goal within an organization, with the senior leadership, with the culture, it's not to win some kind of feedback war. And again, it's like you're there to protect the organization, and you also want to protect your credibility. Like you don't want to lose that. So, I would say again, be careful about correcting and focus more on staying credible, protecting performance, maintaining your integrity, preserving your influence. So, if you're kind of running into some culture that you feel like isn't helpful, I would ask like why are those individuals, because they're again driven by people, why are they acting that way? Are their egos threatened? It's possible. Are they trying to be politically cautious? Do they want to avoid conflict? Are they simply unaware that it's happening? I don't know. So I guess I would first want to understand like what is the reason that this is taking place, and that'll help you frame your approach. So there's not really a one size answer fitting all of these different possibilities. But again, think about like the battle that you want to take on, and make sure you do it from a place of building credibility and value, rather than trying to just correct something, a person, a culture, for unknown reason.
This is absolute gold because you can nearly guarantee that any of our listeners here, especially people who are working in EHS or health and safety roles, that they're feeling this, they're experiencing this, and they're just not sure what to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
It
sometimes it's, is this a one off, or, is this a pattern? Trying to understand what's really going on, I think will help. And then thinking about how do you change that if it's more of a pattern? Um, how do you operate effectively in that type of environment? So again, like having those one-on-ones with people, it's really hard to operate when you're the only one who has a view, or you're trying to change something. So, building those, I hate to use the word alliances, it sounds a little like a TV reality show, but, like coming up with folks that are aligned with you are going to help you, again, have these conversations, and not let them be just like you taking on some battle. Because I think that'll just make you lose credibility in the end. And you may decide, like, I can't operate effectively in this environment. And that's not what we want.
Yeah, let's talk about alliances. I think you're onto something here. And we're obviously not making a cool TV show or anything here, but in the work context, having those alliances seems to be the way to go to influence people and to get people to understand these different points of view that people might have. How have you seen alliances work well and perhaps not work well?
Well, I think it's helpful to start out again with those smaller groups, the one on ones. Start at the operations level, more the site levels. So try to really understand like what is going on at a site. If it's new technology, if it's some change, change management, it's really helpful to start that out at a site and with people who are really close, and maybe they can pilot it, so maybe they're going to pilot something. They're willing to be your sponsor. I find that's, often really critical to the success of the work that we do, is to find that sponsor in operations, and they're willing to run that pilot in your site. So start out small, and then as you get data, again, being equipped, armed with data, now you can take the conversation up, and you can go to that broader group again of your strategic partners that will be appropriate for that particular issue. So maybe, now you need help from the software team, the IT team. So what is that conversation going to look like? It's going to have some impact on performance. So you need to know what that's going to look like. For X days while we make this change, performance may go down some percent. Like, so to understand the trade-offs and what you're really asking for. Because I think so often in these conversations, you can't just go in and say, like, we need to do this. You really need to understand what you are asking of those leaders, so that you come in equipping them to make that decision with speed, and you don't get sort of stuck in that. I think after being at Amazon, where there's like this bias for action, you see how that really is sort of a secret sauce, and you see how other organizations struggle to move that quickly. So in today's environment, the ability to make decisions quickly
Yeah.
is so helpful, and to understand the process that goes into making decisions. How much data you need, how much alignment you need, like when you're able to move forward with something without 100% of the information or everybody on board. So to understand like how you build that decisional architecture in a way that's going to allow you to move forward with that bias for action and still get good decisions.
Heather, if you could go back to the beginning of your career, which competence, because you talk a lot about competence, but which competence would you have developed early to better navigate in all this kind of environment?
Oh gosh. I think I would think of two things that are really special today, and I don't know that I ever would have thought of this back then. One of them, maybe. Like, one I think I would say is the ability to understand the business. So, like, how do you speak that language in terms of ROI, and what does that look like in safety? How do we build that case? And those are things that you begin to learn when you're starting out as a safety professional. It's really an evolution. You don't get equipped with that information early on. So the sooner you can get your boots on the ground and understand that, I think you'll be ahead of people like me who learned it later. So I would say that's one. And then the other is just with all of what's going on with technology, and data. But again, I only say this a little bit. Like, I would love to have been a software developer, so I could build some of the stuff that I think would be incredible, but others are doing it. So again, like, as a safety professional, we don't need to be software developers. We don't need to know all of the back end of all of this that's going on now. And I think sometimes that's where we as safety professionals and all leaders get a little intimidated, because we don't speak that language and we don't know all of that. But you really don't need to. It's just more of a wish list for me. Like, it would be cool to be, cool like a software developer. But like, we don't actually need to know that just to be successful in the age that we're in right now, with AI and technology and all that's going on with data.
Look in your career, Pat, you have held positions are both sides, regulator and executive. So what changed in your mindset, in your view, when you're moving from these sides?
Yeah, I really like it a lot more. I started out as a lawyer, started out as a labor lawyer specifically. And in that career path, I became the chairman of the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. And from there, I went to Amazon. And it wasn't until I went to Amazon that I became a CSP. It was the second half of my career. And it's still safety, but I love that it really is beyond that compliance. And I don't know that I fully appreciated what great work most companies are doing. That safety compliance is typically, I call it the floor. They want to be compliant, but they're trying to do so much more than that. They're trying to move beyond compliance, especially as we've gotten decades and decades further away from the enactment of the OSH Act, because those standards haven't been able to keep pace. And it's so hard to promulgate a new standard, to even update an existing standard. We're seeing that right now with lockout tagout. Like, it would be great to have some updates to that standard to recognize some of the work that's going around, with robotics and locking out short of like physical locks. So like, I love now how I have more of an appreciation for beyond the compliance. And I also love how in doing that work, you learn so much about the business. As a lawyer, oftentimes we parachute in. We parachute in when there's a need, an issue, and you advise, and hopefully your client takes your advice, but sometimes you don't really know. And then you go off to the next project, and you're kind of a fixer, an advice giver in discrete situations. But, as a safety professional, you really get to be that partner and you get to understand the business. And I would say that's something I really love now. So I love that I have both experiences, and I try and bring those together in the work that I do now. And sometimes I work with trade associations in DC and get to be involved in that regulatory space of looking at proposed regulations like the heat rule that's been proposed. So it's great to be able to wear different hats and to recognize how they all kind of come together. But I would say like the thing that I came to a little bit later in my career was really more the true safety professional side, and just how interesting that work is.
(3,800 meters below the North Atlantic, it is still there. Not as a ruin, but as evidence. 15,000 workers, 3 million rivets. The largest movable structure ever built by man and designed to be invincible. But the Titanic didn't sink by accident. It sank by decisions. Decisions made in boardrooms, on spreadsheets, in silences that no one had the courage to break. How was it possible? The answer isn't down there. It's up here, in the decisions we make every day. Soon we will dive into the history, the facts, and what the world's most famous accident taught us. Titanic, the silence we still hear. It's not about the tragedy. It's about what built this tragedy and what we learned from it.
Do you ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it. I can hear it in your voice when you're talking about those different experiences, and it sounds amazing. Do you have a proud moment as you think about your career?
A couple. I mean, I would say being at Amazon through the pandemic at a time that, for everyone, there was so much going on, and especially for safety professionals. I think that we as safety professionals really rose to the challenge of that moment, and it has made those partnerships that we need to succeed outside of the pandemic stronger and better. I mean, it was just great to see how everyone was coming to the table at that time and wanting to help. So we had robotics people, we had software folks, like we had all these people who were coming to the table with ideas that we then implemented in our operations really rapidly, because we wanted to keep people safe. And Amazon was growing during that period of time and getting a lot of external attention because people wanted to know, what was going on. So I would say I'm super proud of the team. And by team, I mean the safety team and much broader team. All of the senior leaders, Dave Clark as CEO of the operations side of the business at that time. So I'm super proud of that moment. And then I would say, like, just a little bit more personally, that being twice Senate confirmed and presidentially appointed is an honor that I'm very grateful for. And I loved the work that I did when I was at the Review Commission too. It's just one of those sort of you really get to think about these issues in a different way, and again recognizing how complex safety can be, and sometimes what happens when there is an incident, that there's a lot of complexity that goes into the operations and the standards. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that when all they do is they look at the decision of a case, and don't understand, what it's like to litigate those cases and the burdens that are on the attorneys who are litigating those cases, and the burdens they have to prove the different elements of the case. And they're huge records. Some of these records were thousands of pages long. So to, do the work that I did there, I just really enjoyed and I'm proud of that moment as well. So thank you for asking.
You gave me goosebumps as you were talking about it, because I talk to a lot of people and many of them are inspired by a career your career that you've had, moving in different roles and, as you mentioned, having such significant experience as well. What advice would you give to people maybe who are working in safety or elsewhere? What can they do to have such prideful moments in their career?
I guess I give two pieces of advice when people come to me. And one I say is do good work. I think that good work becomes the reward. And sometimes people set out with this goal of, like, how do I move up? How do I get the promotion? How do I do the next step on the ladder? And I think that's the wrong focus, in my opinion. Like, I feel like those things will happen when you do good work. You will be recognized for it. So have the passion for the work and delivering good results, and then those things will happen. And then the second thing I say because of that is oftentimes those next opportunities find you, and they may not be the one that you were really thinking of. It may be like, oh, I don't know about that. And we also have this tendency, I think nowadays, because we're so busy, to have this reaction of, like, it's okay to say no. And, I think, especially as busy women, we often hear that, like, it's okay to say no. I don't actually like just the no. What I say is, tell me more, instead of just going right to the no, because I think, again, in my experience, like, some of the opportunities that have come to me that have been the best opportunities in my career were not ones that I would have sought out. So you have to first have a conversation about, like, well, why are you thinking of me, and tell me about this opportunity. So before you get to know, and you may get to know, but just have that conversation, that willingness to learn a little bit more first. And I think that's oftentimes, especially as you continue to move up, opportunities tend to find you. And it's because hopefully you've been doing good work and you're being recognized for it.
Wow, so precious. Tell me more. I would like to return with you to the boardroom, okay? Let's return there. What is the invisible risk that, in your opinion, that the CEOs and boards most underestimated when we're talking about organizational culture and safety?
Ooh, what is the thing that, well, the complexity again, I think, I think a lot of times, very senior leaders, especially if they're not, they're on the board perhaps, and they don't work in the realm of the operations, they don't understand how complex it is. And oftentimes there can be this knee-jerk reaction of just, like, throw some really smart people at the problem. And sometimes it's throw some really smart operators at the problem. Like, they've been really successful in their business and the operation. So, like, take that person who's really successful there and put them on the safety team and they'll be great. And I'm not opposed to having that blend. Like, I actually think that's a really good model. Especially as safety gets more complex, there's room for a lot of different hats under our tent. You need data people, you need, engineers, you need compliance, governance people, you need people who are good in the field, you need more of the enterprise people. So there's a lot of roles within safety, But I'm only just saying, like, there are a lot of really great safety people as well. So don't think necessarily that the solution might be like, let's find an operations person and they'll fix this. So the complexity, I think, is the one that's often misunderstood. And it can even happen with something as traditional as RIR. A lot of times folks don't understand why it may be a different RIR in the US versus Europe. There's things that go into that conversation, and it's not apples to apples comparison.
Speaking of the boardroom, I won't ask you a difficult question on the boardroom, but maybe I'll just ask you, how is it? Because I have often over the years got asked those questions, like, what's it like being in the boardroom, and like, what do you spend even the first 60 seconds on when you get asked to talk? Like, what do you have some tips for us?
Yeah, I mean, I like those meetings. I like those conversations. I find them fun, and I don't know. I look forward to them because I think, again, these leaders are coming from a place of, and I don't think I'm being critical of anyone, but they don't have the same understanding of safety as you going into that boardroom. So they're asking questions to understand, and they're very smart people, very accomplished, in their other roles. So I find them to be really interesting conversations. And I think, again, going in, like, usually you're going to go in with some kind of document that you're going to be presenting to them, and they've probably read it before you step into the room. And so they're probably going to say the first thing coming out of their mouth is like, they'll have a question just based on what you put in that document. So make sure that it's a good narrative, and I don't mean narrative in terms of like creating a story, but like, what is your strategy, and how are you going to inform the board so they can uh, engage in good governance in their role as a board member, and understand that the work that's being done is the right work and it ties to the strategy, and to really know where the organization is going. So they tend to be, for the most part, again, those higher level conversations that are, I would say, come fairly easily to safety professionals, and I just find them enjoyable. But again, you got to be prepared. You can't go into any one of those meetings, not being prepared, because they'll see right through that. But they have the best. They want to see the organization succeed. So again, it's that trust, that credibility, and understanding that we're all doing our jobs to deliver good performance to see this organization succeed.
I usually like to explore the mistakes from safety professionals with you. Do you think that when the safety professional go to be part of the boarding room or to talk with the seniors executive, we talked about this when you start. So how will moderate to be too much technical or have a superficial strategic narrative or a lack of political awareness? So what do you think is the mistakes from the safety professionals?
That is a very good question. Again, I would say leading with compliance instead of business impact. Don't show up that way. Understand the trade-offs that need to be made, and really know the business. And most of the time, it's a deep level of information and analysis. But I think, again, that depends on your audience. And that's what you really need to gauge before you go into the meeting is what is enough data? Because sometimes, you've got an audience that wants very granular data. They understand it. They know the questions to ask. And so you can give them that information. There's going to be other folks that don't, or perhaps on a particular topic or project that you're trying to get approval on. So give them the data and the information at the level that they will understand and that they're seeking. So that's, I think, one really great way. It also helps, again, to have those conversations ahead of time so that you're preparing them for the decisional meeting. So I think a lot of that is like, nowadays, how do you go into a meeting where you're going to make that ask? And you're going to equip them to be able to do that. That's really what we want to accomplish is you're going into this meeting and you really want a decision to come out of it. So what are they going to need to be able to do that?
(3,800 meters below the North Atlantic, it is still there. Not as a ruin, but as evidence. 15,000 workers, 3 million rivets. The largest movable structure ever built by man and designed to be invincible. But the Titanic didn't sink by accident. It sank by decisions. Decisions made in boardrooms, on spreadsheets, in silences that no one had the courage to break. How was it possible? The answer isn't down there. It's up here, in the decisions we make every day. Soon we will dive into the history, the facts, and what the world's most famous accident taught us. Titanic, the silence we still hear. It's not about the tragedy. It's about what built this tragedy and what we learned from it.
Do you ever wonder whether you're making the impact and have the influence that you're really, really looking for in your corporate career, perhaps if you're an entrepreneur or doing something else? Well, I offer one-on-one coaching services for purpose-driven leaders who are really looking to find some way of increasing their impact and their influence. So if this is something you're interested in, give me a call, send me a DM, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
For you, when you're talking about, now we need to take decisions fast. So what is the characteristic? What do you take in counting to take decisions and take good decisions in this fast? And, we need to give an answers. We don't have a recipe. We need to show ways. So what is your recommendation?
Yeah, I guess I would say think about that first 60 seconds, whether it's the conversation that's the opener of the meeting or the first 60 seconds of your document, if it's a white paper. So you're going to assume that safety matters. That's not where you're going to start, but you need some kind of clarity or a decision. And so what does that look like? Lead with what is the decision that is required? What risks are we addressing? What happens if we delay? And what are any of the trade-offs? So that, that way you're framing the conversation in 60 seconds as to this is how we're going to leave the meeting. When we come out of here, we need alignment, we need resources, we need a decision. And you can't just present it as a problem. I think sometimes safety professionals get criticized for that. They identify the problem, and the senior leadership is on board with addressing the problem. They just want to know what's the best way to do that, and what are the considerations, what are the trade-offs that we need to understand so that we can make a decision, and then give you those resources, some, all, none, but we can make a decision to move forward. And not everything's going to be above the line these days, so I think that's part of it, is not making everything be a fire. You have to understand your credibility is based on how much you ask for to some degree. So prioritizing and recognizing that these are the things that we really tie into our strategy. Remember at the beginning of the year where we all came up with that strategic plan and we all agreed upon it? And this was the roadmap to reach that strategic plan. Like now, this is the thing that we need to deliver on that. So, hopefully you've done that pre-work. And that's why I love strategic planning. It's like you begin that conversation and you start sort of at the front line or the safety team building that plan, and then you bring it up to the point that you get alignment on that strategic plan with all of those partners and your senior leaders. And so from there, the decisions become easier because you've already had that debate. And even when it comes to resources and headcount, like it should flow more easily if you've gotten that alignment on the strategic plan to begin with, because hopefully many of those tough decisions have already been made.
What do you think people can do though, and specifically health and safety people, where they've done everything that you just suggested and it still comes back as a no or a like wobbly, or like indecision? This senior leaders are paid a lot of money and given a lot of responsibility to make decisions. But sometimes, even when you're really well prepared, you go into the meeting or you're trying to push along your plan, and you just can't get the buy-in. What do you think they should do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's where you do lean when you can into the urgency. We've had three SIFs in 60 days, or OSHA has begun an inspection on this issue at this site. We're heading in the wrong direction, on leading indicators. This audit finding hasn't been corrected, and it's a potential SIF. I think it's again using the data and tying it to something that creates that urgency and making them accept the trade-off and the decision. If you don't do this, we may see this kind of impact. So again, it's a choice, but want you to own it and understand the trade-off.
And I guess they may make a choice that you don't like. I know that's what I've experienced. I don't know about you, Heather.
Yeah. I mean, they are paid to make decisions.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're going to want to avoid certain decisions. So, there's things that we can do to help them move forward. Again, in terms of talking about risk, talking about, decision timelines and what you're really asking for and why you need to move forward on this at this point or by X date. But, at times they're going to still say no. And you're not always going to be able to get to a yes. So you can come back to things. I mean, that's what I've found. I've had my mind changed on some issues where it wasn't so much, didn't see the value in it, but I also saw that it could be a one-way door decision. And I think that's something that is helpful to understand is this a decision where we don't need all of the information, but we can move forward and change our decision if we get on the other side of that door and decide it was a bad decision. It's easy to reverse. But if it's not easy to reverse, once you make that decision, there's no going back. Those are sometimes decisions that are hard to get leaders to agree to. So it may take time to get to that point because they're, paid to make that decision. They're thinking about reputational risk, perhaps to themselves, and they're conflict avoidant. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons why senior leaders may say no. So you have to, again, think about how you're going to manage this process and understand, what is going on when you hear that no. And is there a way to get to that yes? And sometimes there is.
Peter, I was reading about McKinsey, I research from McKinsey, 70% of the companies, they don't, they have a strategic plan, but they don't have achieve a culture transformation. And one of the cause is culture. So this strategic plan is different. They don't consider the right culture, the right context of this company. How to do different?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really do need to understand your culture because, again, some of the things I'm saying here may not work in your culture. Every culture is different. Maybe you don't use white paper, so that's not how you're going to get to a decision. Understanding your culture is really important because it will also help you build that trust. Um, but also, if you do see that there's a culture that you think needs some improvement, and I would say just about every organization does, like, how do you do that? There's a book called Atomic Habits, which I recommend to people. It's like, how do you make small steps that over time, and I translate it to climate, when we're talking about safety,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
atomic habits are these small shifts that you can take on a daily basis that over time are going to change the culture. So think about that in terms of like what are those small things that you could do in terms of building habit. Think about even your meetings. What are the cadences of your meetings? Who do you include in those meetings and what do they look like? And what is your standard template for that particular meeting? And who is involved? So it may be different for like a weekly business review. You may have one that's at the very senior level, and that's going to go through a lot of operational information, and safety has like 5-10 minutes at the beginning. So that's one. But you could also a weekly business review that's at the business level or geography level. And so you're going to get different people there. And then perhaps you do a deeper dive into incidents that have happened in that past week. Then you have like a monthly business review. So who's included in that, and what does that document look like? And quarterly business review. There could also be like a committee that's like your senior strategic committee when it comes to safety stuff. And hopefully you get the CEO to come to that on a regular basis. And that's where you're really like talking about these big decisions that are going to have an impact on the enterprise, but you need to get sort of that enterprise-wide alignment. And if the CEO agreed it was a good idea, like that would go a long way. So, I think again, it's like thinking about your communication framework,
Yeah.
your templates in terms of how you measure and communicate performance when it comes to safety. And I don't just mean the lagging metrics. I mean like everything that's going on in terms of
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
programs and projects and leading metrics and what you're doing with safety training, and whether you have some kind of perception surveys, that you use on a regular basis. There's so many great tools out there now for like capturing what I call, observations. A lot of like even voice ones. There's, if you have like a armband or glasses, there's things that are going on now where people can just voice text an observation. So like, how are you getting that information and escalating and talking about the learning? So what is the right audience for that?
Such great ideas here.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears for a minute. I was thinking about the topic of power dynamics and how, especially for health and safety professionals, they're at all different levels within an organization, and they may often feel like they don't have the power in a conversation or in a decision. What would you recommend for those folks who feel like there's a power difference in what's going on in their workplace?
Well, I think again, you got to look at your organization because there's a lot of different kind of org structures. You might have a hierarchical one. You may have decentralized. So in between there's a lot of variation. So I think one is to understand what's possible within your organization. If your organization where it's meritocratic, hopefully you can have some influence, even if you're at a lower level or mid level. And I think that's where it's like really important to look at, how can you have influence at that lower mid level, and what does that participation look like? So perhaps it is working on a document. It's working on a Kaizen. It's working on a pilot. So again, there's a lot of ways that you can contribute, and don't underestimate the power of that narrative power. It's not just positional power. Like titles don't guarantee influence. So, think about how you can shape those decisions as they go upstream. So it's talking about the problem, framing the problem, what are the right metrics for this problem? You're controlling those narrative inputs, and again, going back to, good work will be recognized. So, write the paper, engage in the pilot, because those are the kind of things that you do have that ability to influence, and they will go up to the senior leaders over time, and as you have success. And I would
So
say
maybe
also,
put
like,
your hand
keep
up.
your
Yeah.
virtual, yeah, put your hand up and have that virtual briefcase. Like, after you
Oh,
do
yeah.
one of these things, do the after action review of it and do it with those partners that you've worked with. But then also take notes of it in some form and put those in your virtual briefcase so that you can use those as examples. If you're talking to a more senior leader, you get that opportunity for a one-on-one. They might go into your promotional docket if you have to write something for yourself. So it's great to be able to look back and see what you've accomplished. Instead of just like looking up the hill. Look back at the success that you've had, and I bet there's been some things that you can be really proud of, especially if you're keeping track of them and putting your hand up and getting involved.
I would like to explore some tips from your career about how to find the right language, because we are in different rooms and language is so important. You know, so when you are in the with the middle managers, when we are in the with the seniors executive, or with the front line, or with the supportive areas, what is your tip to find the right language to do a right communication?
Well, I would say it's ask a lot of questions and really listen. It's, not asking the questions because you think you know the answer and you want to sort of high five yourself, prove yourself right. Like, there's another book I like. It's called Super Communicators, and it's based on some research that shows that really effective communicators are people who ask it something like 10 to 20 times the average number of questions. So ask questions, and then you'll understand what they're dealing with. Because middle managers, they're super busy. They feel like, oh gosh, here's another thing I'm going to have to do, or a new tool, another thing I'm going to have to deal with, an email. So, like, to really understand what they are dealing with, and developing that relationship. I mean, it really just kind of comes down to empathy and caring and getting to know people. Um, I think that's, again, how you build that trust. So I would start there, ask a lot of questions, meet with people, and just really care, not just care about safety, but care about the work that other people are doing as well.
We're hearing a lot of consultants and safety experts talking about care. And I guess it's always been in the profession. But even Andreza and I talked a couple of months ago with Clive Lloyd, his
Wow.
book, Compliance to Care. And it was an amazing conversation. Heather, I'm curious because you mentioned care. How do you think about that more broadly in the context of health and safety?
Yeah, well, I'm super curious. What was it, Clinton, you said?
It was Clive Lloyd.
Oh, Clive. Okay. I'm super
Yeah.
curious what he had to say about it. Sounds like he's the expert. But I mean, I think it again is, we're all humans. And, even in this world of AI, there are limits to what AI can do. And the biggest limit is that that connection, that human connection, that judgment. So, how do you show that you have that? And it's, for me, it's like investing the time. Like, you can't build relationships with people, anyone in your life, if you're not investing time in them, and in that time that you have with somebody. Because time is the most, precious commodity, I would say. Is, how do you build that relationship? How do you deepen that connection? So I think it comes from conversations of, you actually really do care, and you are listening, and you remember what they said, and you come back to it. Like, you come back to it later and reference that you did hear what they said and considered it, and you're implementing, what they said into your actions.
Amazing.
Yes. So thank you.
Gosh.
I love your story. I love your examples. So wins though today. What is the most important message you would like the audience to take away about safety, organizational culture, influence, and governance today?
One thing I would say, I mean, I guess I would maybe say it's like, again, think about the decision making process. So how do we make that better? You know, and again, if you're talking about those relationships that you have with other people, and mostly we've been talking about, senior leaders, it's they want to know, what decision are you asking me to make, and what is the evidence? What's the data that supports it, and what's the risk to the enterprise if we act or don't act, and what happens next? What does this look like? What are the takeaways from this conversation? We want to do this. We need resources, we need actions, we need owners. So I think it's, again, thinking about how do you drive those decisions, which are then going to tie into not just outcomes, but owning those outcomes, and moving forward with the strategic plan.
Andreza, that was a beautiful question. Maybe I have just one final one to finish us off. Heather, what do you wish people had the courage to have more conversations about?
I think it's those difficult conversations, and I don't know, that it's a lot of times like, what is the thing that is holding us back in this organization? And oftentimes that's not the kind of thing that necessarily gets sorted out on the shop floor, but it probably begins from learning those insights from the front line. But then it's more of a closed door conversation where people really are honest about what is holding an organization back. What is happening in the culture? It could be the psychological safety as an example, but like, to begin to have that conversation for people to speak up and say, this is what we need to change, to really make things better.
Amazing. People need to hear more from you. How can they find you, Heather?
Well, I have a newsletter on LinkedIn. So you can go to my LinkedIn profile and subscribe to my newsletter. Or you can go to my website, which is MacDougallsolutions.com, and check out my blogs, which are basically the newsletters, or check out the services that I offer there.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And hopefully you haven't been hearing my dog snoring on the floor during this podcast.
No, nothing.
I was going to say, I wish we had been hearing the dog snoring. We love dogs.
Yes. So thank you. It was a pleasure to have you here. So much learning with you today. So thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you.
We have reached the end of another episode of the Headline Podcast. Today, more than discussing safety, we talked about responsibility at the highest levels. We talked about real influence. We talked about what sustains or weakens a culture over time. And perhaps the most powerful insight Heather shared with us today is this: culture is not built through large projects. It is built through small daily steps. In the question we choose to ask, in the decisions we choose not to postpone, in the deviation we choose not to normalize, in the conversation we choose not to avoid. Boards and executives don't transform culture through structural initiatives alone. They transform culture through consistency. Small moves every day in the right directions. Because in the end, culture is the accumulated result of repeated decisions. If this conversation challenges you, take this reflection into your next leadership meeting. What is the small step you can take tomorrow that strengthens the culture you claim to value? I am Andreza Araújo, and this was another episode of Headline Podcast. See you in the next episode.